The RBI's Monetary Policy Committee hikes the benchmark repo rate by 35 basis points as expected, decides to remain focused on the withdrawal of accommodation. Repo rate is now at the highest level in more than 5 years. Today's hike is also the lowest in this rate hike cycle.
While we recognize and we state that the worst of inflation is behind us, but there is no room for complacency. We have to be extremely watchful, and we'll have to be nimble in our actions.
RBI Governor Shaktikanta Das says the worst of inflation is behind us, but advises caution going ahead, retains the FY23 forecast at 6.7%, also cuts the full-year GDP growth forecast from 7% to 6.8%. Stock markets see some wild swings, the sensex and the nifty ending in the red after the RBI's rate hike. The rupee gains against the dollar but remains above the 82 mark.
While there is a 25 basis point hike, there is a bit of a hawkish stance in the policy statement.
20-25 basis points hike in rates in the next policy, but then there will, to my mind, be a clear stop thereafter.
India's top bankers say RBI's policy stance remains hawkish and expect another rate hike in February, but expect demand for longer-term loans to sustain despite the monetary tightening. The winter session of Parliament gets going. The Congress and the Trinamool Congress protest against being denied chairmanship of parliamentary standing committees. Congress President Kharge called for a meeting of opposition parties to evolve a joint strategy for the session. The government plans to table as many as 16 new bills. Aam Aadmi Party wins majority in the 250 ward Delhi civic body, looks set to wrest control from the BJP after 15 years. This is the first election after the reunification of the 3 Delhi-based municipal corporations. The Congress comes a distant third. A 5-judge bench of the Supreme Court concludes hearing pleas against demonetization of 500 and 1,000 rupee notes in 2016, asked the union government and the RBI to submit files leading up to the decision. RBI had backed the move before the court, calling it an integral part of nation building. After widespread protest, China starts to move away from its stringent zero-COVID policy, allows people with COVID who have mild symptoms and their close contacts to quarantine at home instead of forcing them into centralized quarantine facilities. India needs to build greater capacity to reduce the reliance on imports, says Boeing India President Salil Gupte. This comes after Civil Aviation Ministry called for curbing imports of aircraft, which had gone up by 56% in the first 6 months of this fiscal. Aviation Minister Jyotiraditya Scindia calls for a meeting with the management of all major airports after scenes of overcrowding and serpentine queues. Airport authorities in Delhi and Mumbai say they have built enough counters, but there is a shortage of CISF and government staff to cater to passengers.
Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. Woohoo!
Fabulous experience it really has been for all of us here at CNBC-TV18 to chronicle India's story.
Asset allocation is key. It was important yesterday, it is important today, it will be important tomorrow.
When we hear about this 10-year, 20-year bull run in India, and everything looks like a Ram Rajya, at that time we have to be little cautious.
Real estate is about location, location, location. Equity markets are about earnings, earnings, earnings.
And so many new businesses we have not even thought about are getting conceptualized, and the spirit of entrepreneurship.
Well, CNBC-TV18 turns 23 today, and we would like to take this opportunity to thank all of our viewers for your continued support, faith and trust over the years. We continue to remain India's #1 business news channel, so thank you once again. Let's begin with the big story this evening. The RBI's Monetary Policy Committee has hiked its benchmark repo rate by 35 basis points, capping its 5th hike this year, also the lowest in this rate hike cycle so far. 5 of the MPC members voted in favour of the rate hike. The repo rate, which is the rate at which the RBI lends to banks, now stands at 6.25%. It's the highest since August of 2018. The Monetary Policy Committee also decided to remain focused on withdrawal of accommodation stance. The RBI has trimmed its GDP growth forecast for FY23 to 6.8% from 7% said earlier, citing geopolitical tensions and global slowdown. It expects the first quarter of the next fiscal year to record a GDP growth of 7.1%. Meanwhile, the inflation forecast for FY23 has been retained at 6.7%. Governor Shaktikanta Das said inflation is expected to moderate, but the battle is not over. He added that the course of the future policy will depend on data and the evolving outlook of the economy.
With regard to inflation, I would like to say that the worst of inflation is behind us. I think this point needs to be taken note of. The worst of inflation is behind us. While inflation is moderating and while we recognize and we state that the worst of inflation is behind us, but there is no room for complacency. We have to be extremely watchful. And we'll have to be nimble in our actions. We have to watchful and we have to act should it become necessary.
The MPC was of the view that further calibrated monetary policy is warranted to keep, number one, inflation expectations anchored, number two, break core inflation persistence, and number three, contain second round effects. As regards the stance of the monetary policy, the MPC took a holistic view of the policy rate and the liquidity conditions relative to inflation. Adjusted for inflation, the policy rate still remains accommodative.
Governor has kept the door open for a possible small hike in the next policy, possible. That is perhaps will emanate out depending on the data that comes through. So at most, I repeat, 20-25 basis points hike in rates in the next policy, but then there will, to my mind, be a clear stop thereafter.
I think the stance is that we need to get inflation under control, and that also very clearly implies maybe another hike of 25 basis points before things stabilize. You know, the hope, while the inflation is coming down, RBI has also very clearly tempered the growth expectations on the GDP side. So it's a balancing act.
Indian interest rates, even though have gone up, but as far as the access to, on a relative basis, to domestic markets is attractive. That is why the cost of financing has gone up, but I don't think because of which any company will hold the capex, because the long-term story of India is very encouraging.
Well, reactions there coming into the equity market story as well as the India growth story. In market action, today was a volatile day of trade. We saw the sensex and the nifty end the day lower, while mid-caps underperformed. Banks fared slightly better. Reliance was among the top nifty losers, while IT stocks were also a big drag. In the money market, the rupee managing to gain against the dollar, snapping the two-day losing streak. However, the rupee remains above the 82 mark against the greenback. Here are market experts with their outlook.
Big picture is that everybody should invest in equities. Over time, equities outperform fixed income. Over time, equities outperform property for most of the investors, maybe not for developers. And therefore, there should be a reasonable allocation to equities, which Indians did not have for a long, long time.
We just pick and choose things that suit our point of view. And the point of view right now is that India is expensive. And I don't know on what metric they call it expensive. And therefore, India needs to underperform. And therefore, we will pick data points to suit that point of view, irrespective of whether the data makes sense or not. My view is simply that 2023 is going to be even better than 2020.
These are very good businesses.
Yes.
I would say they've created tremendous platform. They have a very good corporate governance. Some of the leaders who are leading these companies are extremely passionate and good. So I've started spending time on these companies, and I'm sure somewhere down the line they will become good buys.
We have a lot of budding entrepreneurs who want to, do something for their own self, for the businesses, and I think that is what mid-cap and small-cap is all about. It's all entrepreneur-driven businesses, and the good thing is if you see so many unique businesses are coming up, and so many new businesses we have not even thought about are getting conceptualized. As long as the spirit of entrepreneurship is there, and as long as growth is there, the smaller and mid-sized companies will always grow faster than the large caps.
Well, moving away from the markets, oil prices continue to trade lower today, falling to the lowest levels. Economic uncertainty and the prospect of higher interest rates weighing on prices. Now, Infosys kickstarts its 9,300 crore rupees share buyback process. The company will be buying the shares at a maximum price of 1,850 rupees per unit till next month. The move comes as part of the company's capital allocation policy, which mandates that Infosys return 85% of its free cash flow until 2024 via dividends and buybacks. The winter session of Parliament kicking off today. This session will have 17 working days and end on the 29th of December. The Centre is likely to table 16 new bills in Parliament, including the Trademarks Amendment Bill and the Multi-State Cooperative Societies Bill. Prime Minister Modi addressed both houses appealing for a productive session.
मैं बहुत ही आग्रह के साथ सभी दलों से, सभी सांसदों से इस सत्र को और अधिक प्रोडक्टिव बनाने की दिशा में सामूहिक प्रयास हो.
And Pariksha joins us now to take us through the key developments of the day on day one of the winter session. Lots of replies coming in to the questions being posed to government, Pariksha.
Yes, you heard the Prime Minister there urging parliamentarians to conduct the House smoothly, make sure the legislative agenda is not impacted. Leaders of 13 political parties met this morning and 20 issues have been identified by the opposition to be raised during the winter session. The government replied to questions of parliamentarians on various economic issues, such as Coal Ministry telling Parliament that total import of coal increased to 38.84 million tonnes in FY23 compared to 27 million tonnes in the whole of FY22. Much of the increase in import has gone to feed domestic coal-based plants, and the restoration of power generation by ICB plants to its potential level has remained slow. Responding to a question on whether Concor divestment would be completed by FY23, the Ministry of Railways said that the government has recently conducted meetings with potential investors and any further steps will be taken on basis of evaluation of interest and successful completion of process under the prevailing market conditions. Ministry of Communications told Parliament that 5G services have started in 50 towns. The Ministry of Road Transport replied about electric vehicles and said 18 lakh electric vehicles have been registered in the country so far, and there are 5,151 operational public EV charging stations. So the opposition wanting to hold the government accountable on the economic situation in the country as well. So we will be hearing those questions and debates over the next few days.
Many thanks for joining us. We will head into a break, but up next, there's special guests who join us to mark our 23rd anniversary. That and more when we return. Well, CNBC-TV18 has turned 23 today, and here's a special guest to mark that milestone with us. Rajesh Bagav, the co-founder and group CFO at Make My Trip, is here with us. And just like CNBC-TV18, Make My Trip is also more than 2 decades old and was started pretty much around the same time. Rajesh, thanks very much for joining us here on CNBC-TV18. And as I said, we've sort of run our journeys almost parallelly. So let me start by asking you, Rajesh, you know, so much has changed, not just for Make My Trip, but for India and, you know, for the travel and the hospitality space. What have been the biggest changes, the big inflection points that you can recount over the past 2 decades plus?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. And by the way, congratulations, firstly. You know, this is a big milestone, and you're absolutely right. We are getting there, by the way, turning 23 on 1st April 23. So just getting there. So pretty much actually the same number of years that we've been in existence as well. And lots have changed. I mean, you know, over the last over 2 decades now, if I really look back, as we, you know, sometimes sort of see out here as well, as we were turning 22, earlier this year, and we were talking about it. Just from an ecosystem standpoint, just to call out a few sort of big, disruptions or the changes or the milestones that we saw over the last 2 decades. I'm sure you would have seen pretty much the same as well. I think in terms of just in our industry, which is, let's say, travel technology industry, or overall internet-led businesses, or the ecosystem which was supporting all the internet businesses, have significantly changed. I recall the time when back in 2000, there used to be like, one payment gateway, for instance. And then now, fast forward today, the whole digital payment ecosystem has completely changed. So much so that in this area, we are actually ahead of China already. And we used to be, whenever we would draw that analogy, we would always say that, in terms of just overall infrastructure and specifically on digital infrastructure, we might be 10 years or 15 years behind, if not more. But I think we've caught up significantly on that front. So just overall, ecosystem changing significantly in our favor in India. And then I think the game changer also was, if you really, sort of look back, in terms of just the internet access device, if you go back in history, and it's not too far ago, where the whole market used to be, or the predominant internet access device used to be our, the PCs or the laptops, and the entire game changed in favor of small device, in smartphones. And then the penetration of smartphones in India again skyrocketed phenomenally. Today, about 600, 700 million smartphones there, and they completely changed the game in terms of, just shifting the power to individuals from metro cities to the tier 2 cities to the tier 3 cities and the tier 4 cities. And so much so, if you relate it back with, in terms of, the bandwidth improving, I'm sure you would recall, and, we used to talk about it for the longest time. I remember in 2010, when we IPO'd in US, we used to be like 120 million internet users, but broadband users used to be only 10 million. And then, the mobile bandwidth, the last mile mobile bandwidth completely changed the game. And now bandwidth is not the question mark anymore. And now we're getting into 5G when the 5G has been launched as well. And in your industry, there was a direct sort of benefit of that in terms of, just the rendering of the content. Now we don't really have to worry about the market shifting to huge amount of additionally sort of digital platforms coming in your space as well. So the bandwidth, I would say, would be the other sort of big, massive disruption that happened, and we've caught up significantly as well. In some of these areas, we've actually leapfrogged and done better than the Western world, maybe behind China, but we've done better than the Western world.
Yes, certainly have made significant progress there as far as the digital story is concerned. But let's talk about what's happening with the hospitality and travel story at this point in time, Rajesh. We're pretty much back to pre-COVID levels. Airports are back to capacity. In fact, that's proving to be a challenge at this point in time, with overcrowding being witnessed across major airports. In fact, we understand that the Minister, Jyotiraditya Scindia, has had a meeting just today to be able to deal with that. In terms of travel trends and how sustainable this is likely to be, given the bounce back and the rebound we've seen, what are you suggesting at this point?
No, absolutely. And I saw those visuals, and I've been experiencing that chaos as well. I mean, for whatever it's worth, as the travel picked up, right? I mean, there's huge amount of travel for the last 3-4 quarters that's been happening across, and whether it is domestic or even international. So, but when you, on one side, you sort of visually see that chaos and you experience that, but the reality also is that, and that again, our minister sort of made that comment yesterday, if I recall well, that the overall, we are still little behind than the pre-pandemic number when it comes to the domestic travel flow numbers on a daily basis, but we're getting there, right? And then the overall international might still be a little behind, thanks to fares being high, maybe the capacity issues, maybe also the operational issues related to visas, etc. But the good news is as follows. The good news is the consumer sentiment remains very, very positive. And the long-term outlook remains very positive. And if you compare the India position with respect to just the domestic economy, just because of the sheer size of the India market and the consumer economy that we have, we are much better poised than the rest of the world when you compare it on any metric at this point in time, whether it's the inflation overall or the GDP growth, as we just saw the number coming out of RBI today as well, and various agencies for that matter. So I would say overall, the consumer growth, consumer sentiment is positive.
Right.
Some of these things need to improve in terms of more capacity needs to come in, and therefore fares need to get rationalized. And the operational chaos has to get over because, people have suffered, all the agencies supporting this industry have suffered in terms of talent going away, and which is slowly and gradually coming back. And, everybody is sort of overwhelmed with the demand right now and not being able to sort of cope up from a processes and the people standpoint. All that has to go away. And my sense is they'll go away in a quarter or two. And if we continue to sort of see the same consumer sentiment and get into the new year with optimism, I'm certainly very optimistic about that.
Yeah.
And the inflation, and if let's say if the like our RBI governor said, right, so the worst of inflation might be behind us.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, I think the outlook continues to remain pretty positive.
Well, consumer sentiment is looking strong, but that's proving to be a challenge as far as the hospitality and aviation business specifically is concerned. And we hope that is going to be something that is going to be addressed, but there is going to be no short-term quick fix at this point in time, given the fact that there are capacity constraints, manpower constraints as well. But Rajesh Magao, a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us on this special day. We appreciate you making time for us, not just today, but through the course of the past 2 decades. And with
Thank you.
it is time for us to wrap up this edition of Business 360. Do stay tuned. We've got a special guest joining us after the break.